The avoidant operates for years under the comfortable delusion that their emotional distance protects them from pain, that their independence makes them superior to people who need emotional connection, and that the love they systematically reject represents weakness rather than the very thing their wounded soul has been craving all along. They navigate relationships with the arrogant certainty that they can always find someone else, that their emotional limitations are sophisticated boundaries rather than profound dysfunction, and that walking away from genuine love represents strength rather than the cowardice it actually demonstrates. But occasionally, rarely, an avoidant encounters their breaking point, the devastating moment when their psychological defenses crack and they're forced to confront the brutal reality that they've destroyed something genuinely valuable, that the person they pushed away represented real love rather than the suffocating entrapment they feared, and that their defensive strategies have been protecting them from the very connection that could have healed their attachment wounds and provided the satisfaction they unconsciously crave. This breaking point doesn't arrive through gentle realization or therapeutic insight, but through accumulated evidence that forces recognition past their elaborate defensive systems, when their new relationships prove hollow and unsatisfying, when they watch their former partner thrive without them, when they discover that their supposed independence has created the profound loneliness and emptiness they were trying to avoid through their sophisticated emotional management strategies and systematic relationship sabotage. Understanding the avoidance breaking point becomes essential for anyone who has loved someone incapable of receiving that love. Not because it offers hope for reconciliation or suggests they deserve your sympathy, but because it reveals that their inability to value you reflected their limitations rather than your inadequacy, their wounds rather than your worth, and their emotional poverty rather than any legitimate assessment of your capacity to provide genuine love and authentic partnership. The breaking point represents the moment when their carefully constructed emotional walls become prison rather than protection, when the gap between their defensive narratives and their authentic needs becomes impossible to ignore, when their independence reveals itself as elaborate loneliness disguised as strength, and when they finally recognize that their fear of vulnerability has cost them the very connection their attachment wounds required for healing. Most avoidants never reach this breaking point because their defenses prove too sophisticated, their fear too powerful, and their capacity for self-deception too elaborate to allow authentic recognition of their role in relationship destruction and their systematic rejection of the love they actually needed. They continue through life pushing away genuine connections while maintaining comfortable narratives about their partners being too needy rather than confronting their own profound inability to sustain authentic intimacy. For the rare avoidant who does break, the experience proves devastating precisely because it forces them to see themselves as they actually are, rather than as they've pretended to be, not emotionally sophisticated individuals with healthy boundaries, but profoundly wounded people whose defensive strategies have systematically destroyed their access to the love and connection they unconsciously craved, but were too terrified to receive, appreciate, or reciprocate appropriately. The breaking point reveals that beneath their emotional distance and defensive superiority lies someone who has been running from their own attachment needs, that their independence has been protecting them from confronting their terror of being truly known and potentially rejected, and that their systematic relationship destruction has served their fears rather than their authentic desires for human connection and meaningful partnership. Understanding this breaking point doesn't require you to forgive their emotional abuse, provide them comfort during their crisis, or maintain hope for their transformation. It simply helps you recognize that their destruction of your love reflected their profound damage rather than your value, their limitations rather than your inadequacy, and their psychological wounds rather than any legitimate assessment of your worth as a human being deserving of authentic love and genuine reciprocal care. The avoidance journey to this breaking point typically requires the complete destruction of their comfortable self-deceptions. the elimination of their ability to maintain their defensive narratives, and the accumulation of enough loneliness and regret to overcome their attachment wounds, powerful resistance to authentic self-awareness and meaningful accountability for their systematic destruction of genuine love. The moment of reckoning when reality breaks through, the avoidance breaking point, typically arrives not through gentle awakening or gradual realization, but through accumulated evidence that overwhelms their sophisticated rationalization machinery, forcing them to confront the devastating reality that their defensive strategies have systematically destroyed their access to genuine love and authentic connection. This moment often occurs when multiple life circumstances converge to eliminate their ability to maintain comfortable self-deceptions about their emotional sophistication and relationship patterns. This reckoning frequently emerges when their new relationships prove fundamentally unsatisfying, despite providing the emotional distance they claim to need. When their replacement partners reveal themselves as hollow substitutes for the genuine connection they destroyed, and when they discover that changing partners hasn't eliminated the profound loneliness and emptiness that characterizes their internal emotional landscape, regardless of their relationship status or external circumstances. Understanding this moment means recognizing that avoidance can maintain their defensive narratives only when they can blame their partners for relationship failures, when they can justify their emotional distance as reasonable response to others' neediness, and when they can maintain the illusion that their independence represents strength rather than fear. When life circumstances eliminate these protective rationalizations, their defensive system begins cracking under accumulated evidence. The breaking point often coincides with watching you move forward without them, seeing you thrive in ways that contradict their narrative about you being too emotionally dependent, and recognizing that you found peace and satisfaction that they cannot achieve despite their supposed emotional superiority and sophisticated understanding of relationships and attachment dynamics. This moment of reckoning typically includes the devastating recognition that they've been running the same destructive script across all their relationships, that their patterns rather than their partner's inadequacy explain their consistent relationship failures, and that their defensive narratives about needing space and independence have been protecting them from accountability for their systematic rejection of genuine love and authentic partnership. The reckoning also includes their painful recognition that you specifically represented something irreplaceable, not because you were perfect, but because you offered authentic love, genuine patience, and sustained emotional investment despite their defensive behavior, creating connection depth that their subsequent relationships cannot replicate, regardless of how hard they try to find someone who provides the same care without demanding reciprocity. Most significantly, this moment forces them to confront the gap between their self-perception and their actual behavior, between their belief in their emotional sophistication and their consistent pattern of destroying relationships through defensive withdrawal, between their claims of healthy independence and their profound inability to sustain genuine intimate connections with emotionally healthy partners. The reckoning often arrives with devastating clarity during moments of genuine need, when they discover that their systematic emotional distance has eliminated their access to authentic support, that people who once cared for them have learned to protect themselves through boundaries, and that their independence has created profound isolation that cannot be resolved through their usual tactics of casual connection and superficial relationship maintenance. Understanding this breaking moment reveals that avoidance can recognize their patterns only when their defensive systems fail, catastrophically when accumulated loneliness overwhelms their capacity for rationalization, and when life circumstances force them to confront that their emotional distance has created exactly the abandonment and isolation they were trying to prevent through their sophisticated defensive strategies. The moment proves particularly devastating because it forces recognition not just of what they lost in you, but of their entire life pattern of destroying valuable connections. of their consistent choice of safety over satisfaction, and of their systematic preference for emotional distance over genuine love that has left them profoundly alone despite their supposed independence and their elaborate narratives about their partner's emotional excess. Most tragically, this recognition often arrives too late to repair the damage they've inflicted, too late to recover the relationship they've destroyed, and too late to benefit from the love you offered when you still possess the emotional capacity to provide it without resentment or the protective boundaries you've since developed to prevent future exploitation. The reckoning also includes their painful awareness that they possessed all the information necessary to make different choices. They knew your worth, they understood your patience, they recognized your genuine love, but their attachment wounds and defensive programming prevented them from acting on this knowledge until after they destroyed their access to the very connection they needed most for healing and satisfaction. The collapse of their independence fantasy. The avoidance breaking point includes the devastating collapse of their most cherished self-deception, that their emotional independence represents strength, sophistication, and healthy self-sufficiency rather than the elaborate defense mechanism it actually is. This collapse occurs when accumulated evidence forces them to recognize that their independence has been protecting them from authentic connection while creating the profound isolation and emptiness they most fear experiencing in their carefully constructed emotional fortress. This fantasy crumbles when they finally acknowledge that their supposed self-sufficiency has been parasitic dependence on others' emotional labor, that their independence has required your patient accommodation of their limitations, and that their autonomy has been subsidized by your willingness to provide emotional support without receiving reciprocal care. They discover that their independence wasn't authentic strength, but elaborate performance requiring supporting cast who provided what they couldn't provide for themselves. Understanding this collapse means recognizing that avoidance built their identity around their capacity to function without emotional dependency, convincing themselves that their ability to remain detached proves their superiority over people who require consistent emotional connection and authentic, intimate engagement. When this identity crumbles, they lose the foundation of their self-concept and their primary justification for their relationship patterns. The independence fantasy collapses when they realize that what they labeled as others' neediness was actually normal human requirement for reciprocal care, that what they dismissed as emotional excess was authentic vulnerability they were too afraid to match, and that what they characterized as suffocating closeness was genuine intimacy they systematically rejected because their attachment wounds made such connection feel psychologically dangerous. This collapse includes their painful recognition that their independence has been loneliness disguised as choice, that their emotional distance has been fear disguised as wisdom, and that their self-sufficiency has been profound neediness disguised as strength through sophisticated psychological defenses that protected their ego while preventing authentic self-awareness about their emotional limitations. The avoidant discovers that their celebrated independence has prevented them from developing essential emotional skills that healthy adults require for psychological well-being, the capacity to ask for help, the ability to receive care gracefully, the skill of maintaining emotional connection during difficulty, and the courage to remain vulnerable even when such vulnerability creates temporary discomfort or exposes their authentic needs. Most devastatingly, the fantasy collapse forces them to confront that their independence has made them profoundly dependent on finding partners willing to accept minimal emotional investment, that their autonomy has required exploiting others' generosity and patience, and that their self-sufficiency has been sustained through systematic emotional parasitism on people whose care they dismissed as weakness while depending on it for their psychological stability. The collapse also includes recognition that their independence narratives have been protecting them from acknowledging how desperately they needed you, how much they depended on your emotional labor, and how completely they relied on your patience to maintain relationship stability, while they contributed minimal reciprocal care and emotional investment in your well-being and satisfaction. Understanding this collapse reveals that the avoidance independence has been their most elaborate self-deception, their most cherished defense, and their most effective barrier against recognizing their profound need for the authentic connection they've spent their life systematically destroying through defensive strategies that prioritize psychological safety over genuine satisfaction and meaningful partnership. The independence fantasy crumbles when they attempt to replicate their relationship with you and discover that their patterns don't work with people who possess healthy boundaries, that their emotional distance doesn't feel sophisticated with partners who require reciprocity, and that their independence doesn't feel empowering when nobody cares enough about their presence or absence to accommodate their defensive limitations. Most significantly, the collapse forces them to recognize that authentic independence would include capacity for genuine interdependence, that healthy autonomy would allow intimate connection without identity loss, and that real strength would enable vulnerability rather than requiring its systematic elimination through defensive emotional management strategies that have created the isolation they most fear. The fantasy's destruction leaves them facing the reality that they've built their entire identity around a lie, that their supposed superiority has been profound dysfunction, and that their celebrated emotional distance has been cowardice that prevented them from experiencing the very love and connection their attachment wounds required for healing and their authentic self craved despite their defensive programming. Witnessing your thriving without them. The avoidance breaking point intensifies dramatically when they observe you flourishing in their absence. When they witness you achieving the happiness and emotional stability they convince themselves you couldn't experience without their presence, and when they recognize that your life has improved measurably since their departure, rather than collapsing in the way their ego required to maintain comfortable narratives about their importance in your emotional world. This witnessing typically occurs through social media observations, mutual friend reports, or chance encounters where they confront evidence that contradicts their defensive narratives about your emotional dependence on them. They discover that you've not only survived their abandonment, but actually thrived through it, developing into a more confident, peaceful, and satisfied version of yourself that their presence was apparently preventing rather than enhancing. Understanding their reaction to your thriving means recognizing that avoidants need to believe their partners cannot function without them, that their emotional distance created valuable space rather than harmful neglect, and that their departure represents loss rather than liberation for the people they've systematically undervalued. Your thriving eliminates these comfortable self-deceptions and forces painful recognition of their actual impact. The avoidant watches you radiating genuine happiness that they never witnessed during your relationship, observing you engaging in activities and relationships that demonstrate emotional fulfillment they couldn't provide, and recognizing that you've developed into the person you were always capable of becoming, once freed from the emotional burden of managing their defensive patterns and accommodation of their limitations. This observation proves particularly devastating because it reveals that you weren't the emotionally unstable, overly dependent person they characterized you as during relationship conflicts. Your post-relationship success demonstrates that your emotional needs were normal and healthy, while their inability to meet those needs reflected their dysfunction rather than your excessive demands or unrealistic expectations. The avoidant also witnesses you receiving from others the emotional reciprocity they couldn't provide, watching you experience the genuine partnership they were incapable of sustaining, and recognizing that your capacity for love and connection has found more appropriate recipients who appreciate and reciprocate your emotional investment rather than exploiting it, while providing minimal care in return. Most painfully, they observe that you've stopped waiting for them, stopped hoping for their change, and stopped organizing your emotional life around someone who systematically demonstrated their inability to provide the basic respect and reciprocal care that healthy relationships require from both partners. Your indifference to their presence or absence proves more devastating than your anger or pain ever could. The witnessing includes their recognition that you've developed the very independence they claim to value, achieving the emotional self-sufficiency they insisted you lacked, and demonstrating the psychological strength they accused you of not possessing. Your actual independence reveals that their criticism of your neediness was projection of their own emotional limitations rather than accurate assessment of your character. Understanding their devastation at your thriving reveals that they needed to believe you would suffer without them, that their presence in your life was more valuable than burdensome, and that their emotional distance was sophisticated boundary setting rather than harmful neglect that prevented your full flourishing and authentic self-expression within the relationship. The avoidant discovers that you found peace in their absence, that the chaos and anxiety that characterized your time together has been replaced by stability and contentment, and that your emotional well-being has improved dramatically without the constant stress of managing their defensive patterns and accommodating their emotional limitations while receiving minimal reciprocal care. Most significantly, witnessing your thriving forces them to confront that they weren't the prize in your relationship, but rather the obstacle to your happiness, that their departure was gift rather than loss, and that your life has been enhanced rather than diminished by their absence from it. This recognition destroys their comfortable narratives about their value and importance. The observation also includes their painful awareness that you've moved beyond them emotionally, that you've processed your grief and emerged stronger, and that you've learned from the relationship in ways that have improved your life, while they remain stuck in identical patterns that continue destroying every connection they attempt to establish with emotionally healthy partners who require reciprocity. The painful recognition of irreplaceability, the avoidance breaking point, reaches its most devastating intensity when they finally recognize that you were irreplaceable, not because you were perfect or because they couldn't find other partners, but because the specific combination of patience, understanding, genuine love, and emotional generosity you offered represents a rarity they will likely never encounter again in someone willing to invest such resources in their emotionally limited and defensively unavailable personality. This recognition typically emerges after cycling through multiple replacement relationships that failed to provide the emotional depth, authentic care, and sustained investment you offered, despite receiving minimal reciprocity. The avoidant discovers that most people possess healthy boundaries that prevent them from tolerating the emotional neglect and defensive patterns you endured while maintaining hope for their growth and capacity for reciprocal care. Understanding their recognition of your irreplaceability means acknowledging that avoidants typically take people for granted while they have them, assuming that love, patience, and emotional investment are readily available commodities that can be found in any relationship rather than recognizing these qualities as exceptional gifts that require specific personality, characteristics, and emotional capacity that most people don't possess or won't deploy for someone who systematically demonstrates their inability to appreciate or reciprocate such generosity. The avoidant realizes that you specifically possessed a rare combination of emotional intelligence that allowed you to see their potential beneath their defensive behavior, empathy that enabled you to understand their attachment wounds without excusing their harmful patterns, and strength that permitted you to maintain your own identity while providing them space for their emotional limitations and defensive requirements. This recognition proves particularly painful because it forces them to acknowledge that they destroyed something genuinely valuable through their own choices, that they had access to the very love and connection their attachment wounds required for healing, and that their defensive programming prevented them from appreciating what you offered until after they'd successfully driven you away through their systematic emotional neglect. The avoidant discovers that subsequent partners cannot match your emotional capacity, that new relationships feel hollow compared to the depth you offered, and that their current connections lack the authentic investment and genuine care that characterized your relationship, despite their defensive behavior and consistent emotional unavailability that should have eliminated your patience and willingness to invest. Most devastatingly, they recognize that your specific qualities, your patience without doormat behavior, your understanding without enabling, your love without desperate neediness, represented perfect conditions for their potential healing and growth that they systematically rejected because their attachment wounds made such perfect conditions feel threatening rather than recognizing them as the gift they actually represented. The recognition includes their painful awareness that they compared you unfavorably to idealized fantasies during your relationship, that they dismissed your genuine qualities while pursuing impossible standards, and that they failed to appreciate your actual worth while searching for perfection that would have felt equally threatening to their defensive programming if they had actually encountered it. Understanding their recognition means acknowledging that they finally see you as you actually were, rather than through the distorted lens of their defensive programming that minimized your worth to protect them from acknowledging how much they needed you and how devastating losing you would be if they allowed themselves to become genuinely attached and emotionally dependent on your continued presence. The avoidant realizes that your irreplaceability stems not from you being objectively superior to all other humans, but from your specific willingness to invest in them despite their limitations, your particular combination of qualities that match their needs, and your exceptional patience that most emotionally healthy people wouldn't provide to someone who demonstrated such consistent inability to reciprocate care and emotional investment. Most significantly, this recognition forces them to confront that they will likely never find another person willing to provide what you offered while tolerating what you endured, that their emotional limitations eliminate their access to partners with your emotional capacity, and that their defensive patterns ensure they destroy any relationship that begins approaching the depth and authenticity that characterized your connection before they systematically sabotaged it. The painful recognition also includes their awareness that they cannot recreate what they destroyed, that apologies cannot undo years of emotional neglect, and that their sudden appreciation of your worth comes too late to matter because you've developed the boundaries and self-protection that prevent you from accepting their belated recognition as sufficient reason to risk further emotional investment in someone who has proven their inability to sustain reciprocal care. When no one else tolerates their emotional distance, the avoidance breaking point intensifies when they discover that emotionally healthy partners refuse to tolerate the defensive patterns you endured, that people with appropriate boundaries establish consequences for emotional unavailability that you didn't enforce, and that their new relationships end quickly once their patterns emerge because others won't provide the unlimited patience and understanding that characterized your approach to their limitations and defensive behavior. This realization typically occurs after experiencing multiple relationship failures where partners exit far more quickly than you did, where people establish firm boundaries around acceptable treatment that you never maintained, and where their emotional distance generates immediate consequences rather than the patient accommodation you provided, while hoping their capacity for intimacy would eventually develop through your sustained emotional investment and understanding. Understanding this dynamic means recognizing that you unconsciously enabled their dysfunction by tolerating behavior that emotionally healthy people recognize as unacceptable relationship conduct, that your patience allowed them to avoid confronting the consequences of their defensive patterns, that your sustained investment, despite minimal reciprocity, prevented them from recognizing how their emotional unavailability affects partners with appropriate self-respect and healthy boundaries, The avoidant encounters partners who demand reciprocity from the beginning, who exit relationships at first signs of emotional withholding, and who refuse to invest emotional energy in someone whose defensive patterns demonstrate their inability to provide the mutual care and authentic presence that healthy relationships require from both partners. These experiences force recognition that your tolerance was exceptional rather than standard relationship expectation. This encounter with healthy boundaries proves devastating because it reveals that their defensive patterns are broadly unacceptable rather than simply incompatible with your specific attachment style, that their emotional distance is recognized as dysfunction rather than sophisticated independence, and that their relationship approach eliminates their access to partners with the emotional depth and capacity that you possessed and generously offered despite receiving minimal reciprocity. The avoidant discovers that people with self-respect won't wait indefinitely for emotional availability that never materializes, won't tolerate emotional neglect while maintaining hope for change, and won't accept relationship dynamics where one person provides everything while the other contributes minimal emotional investment and reciprocal care. These encounters force them to recognize that your patience was gift rather than weakness. Most painfully, they realize that emotionally healthy partners interpret their defensive patterns as red flags requiring immediate exit rather than challenges to be overcome through patient understanding. That people with appropriate boundaries protect themselves from emotional unavailability rather than accepting it as personality quirk requiring accommodation, and that your willingness to tolerate their patterns was exceptional rather than standard relationship behavior. The avoidant encounters rapid rejection from partners who recognize their patterns quickly and refuse to invest in someone demonstrating such clear inability to provide reciprocal emotional care, forcing them to acknowledge that maintaining relationships requires emotional availability they cannot consistently provide, and that most people won't tolerate the defensive distance that characterized their treatment of you throughout your relationship. Understanding this dynamic reveals that your tolerance allowed them to avoid confronting their pattern's impact, that your patience prevented them from experiencing natural consequences that might have motivated change earlier, and that your sustained investment despite minimal reciprocity was abnormal generosity rather than standard relationship expectation that they could find elsewhere. The avoidant realizes that their emotional distance eliminates their access to partners with your emotional capacity because people with such capacity possess corresponding self-respect that prevents them from tolerating treatment you endured, that their defensive patterns ensure they can only maintain relationships with people who possess similar emotional limitations, and that their dysfunction has permanently eliminated their access to the depth and authenticity you offered. Most significantly, this recognition forces them to acknowledge that they cannot find another you because people with your emotional capacity won't tolerate their defensive patterns once they understand them, that their best relationship outcome involves connecting with someone equally unavailable, and that their emotional limitations ensure they'll never again experience the depth of care and authentic investment you provided before they successfully destroyed your willingness to continue offering such generosity to someone incapable of reciprocal care and sustained emotional presence.